Our next speaker is Heather Sharkey. Heather Sharkey is professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of several books. One published in 2003 is entitled Living with Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. Her second book was published in 2008 by Princeton University Press and is titled American Evangelicals in Egypt, Missionary Encounters in an Age of Empire. Professor Sharkey has also edited 2 volumes, one with the title Cultural Conversions, Unexpected Consequences of Christian Missionary Encounters in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, which was published in 2013. With Mehmet Ali Doğan, she co-edited in 2011 American Missionaries in the Modern Middle East, Foundational Encounters. She has also recently co-edited a bilingual special issue in French and English of the Canadian Journal of African Studies on the theme of Rethinking Sudan Studies. Her newest book that she authored is A History of Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the Middle East, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. The title of her paper is Middle Eastern Christianity Between the Local and the Global. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sharkey.
Thank you. Okay, hello everybody again, and I have to say, it's a great honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've been enjoying the other speeches tremendously and talking to people, but again, it really is a privilege. Oops, there we go. I want to make sure. Can you see that? Yeah, great, okay. 10 years ago, I decided to write a chapter, or I agreed to write a chapter about the Middle East for a volume that a colleague, Charles Farhadian, was developing with college students in mind. The book was called Introducing World Christianity, and it aimed to provide snapshots of Christianity in different parts of the world while explaining historical developments and present trends. To get a sense of how others had approached the subject so that I could, figure out what contribution I was going to make, I decided to look at previous surveys of modern and contemporary global Christianity. And one of the surveys I examined was called The Christian World. And its author, Martin Marty, came from this institution. Professor Marty used a phrase in that book that has stuck in my mind ever since. He described the Middle East as a place where Christianity in modern times was hanging on. Many others have described the precarious footing of Middle Eastern Christianity, yet he described it with particular clarity by using just these 2 words, hanging on. The Middle East is the place where Jesus lived and died, the place where Christianity began, and yet Christianity contracted in this very region during the Islamic era. In contrast to regions like what we heard about this morning, places like Sub-Saharan Africa, where Christianity was booming as the early 21st century opened, Christianity in the Middle East offered lessons about persistence in the face of difficult conditions. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 prompted large refugee movements, with Christians, as many observers observed at the time, disproportionately represented among them. We could say the same about displacements that occurred more recently in the wake of the Syrian civil war. As more Christians also emigrate voluntarily, trickling out of countries like Egypt, the description of hanging on has seemed ever more apt. In my talk today, I propose to take a long historical view of this subject before assessing where we are now. I will briefly discuss why and how Christianity went from a state of being the politically and demographically dominant religion in the Mediterranean zones of what's now the Middle East and North Africa to being what we'd call today a minority religion. I will then consider some of the changes that began to press in on the Middle East in the modern era of the 19th and 20th centuries, when foreign Christian missionaries introduced new opportunities but also new pressures, and when substantial Christian emigration from the region began. I will also briefly consider secular nationalism as a challenge that it posed to Christians. And I'm going to argue in the process two things. First is that the study of Christianity in the Middle East can illustrate how the mechanics of Muslim Christian, but also Christian Christian or intra-Christian relations have worked and affected each other. And second, regarding the wider world, I will argue that Middle Eastern Christianity can help us to understand global Christianity singular or global or world Christianities plural in terms of long-distance linkages born from movements, ruptures, and contacts. Islam emerged in the 7th century and fostered what many Muslims came to think of as a deen wa dawla, meaning both a religion and a state. The earliest Muslims developed an army, staged conquests, and established an empire formed from lands that had belonged to the late Roman or Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian or Persian Empire. In this new territory, leaders devised policies while consulting with experts in Muslim scripture, the Quran, and bodies of emergent law, practice, and tradition. Some of these policies ended up restricting the growth of Christian communities, while either assimilating people into Muslim communities or giving others incentives to join them. And in a nutshell, early Muslim rulers recognized that Christians, like Jews, as people of the book, meaning monotheists who had scriptural traditions, could have protection if they surrendered upon conquest. Muslim rulers granted conquered peoples freedom of worship and livelihood as long as they remained loyal to the Muslim state, recognized Muslim dominance, and paid a special tax to the central treasury. This tax was called the jizya, and Christians and Jews paid it on top of anything else that they paid to support charity within their own respective communities. Muslim authorities called Christians and Jews dhimmis, meaning people who lived under the Muslim state's pact of protection. The conquest agreements of the early Islamic Empire established customs that persisted with variations for centuries. Christians could not repair or build churches without acquiring special permission from Muslim rulers. They could not disturb the soundscape by ringing church bells. Christians could not bear arms, ride horses, or serve in Islamic armies. They were supposed to wear special clothes to set themselves apart, and so on. And many of these restrictions lasted in their broad contours into the 19th century, while some, like restrictions on church building, persist in certain places even today. An Islamic system of jurisprudence took clearer shape too, and with it Islamic states recognized courts of law that asserted, for example, that non-Muslims could not inherit from Muslims. Thus, Christian wives of Muslim men or Christian relatives of recent converts to Islam lost rights of inheritance unless they also joined the Muslim community. Islamic laws and policies regarding conversion, which are still largely in place too, had a serious effect on Christians. Islamic law held that anyone could join Islam, but that no Muslim could leave it once converted or born to the faith. Leaving Islam amounted to apostasy, a crime theoretically punishable by death. So while Christians and Jews could join Islam, they could not switch to other religions. Likewise, Jews could not become Christians, just as Christians could not become Jews. Conversion could only go in one direction. Islamic law also defined the children of Muslim fathers as Muslim, regardless of their mothers' religions. And at the same time, Islamic law allowed Muslim men to marry Christian or Jewish women as fellow believers in God, even while Christian and Jewish men could not reciprocally marry Muslim females. These policies facilitated conversions to Islam, confirmed the attrition or demographic contraction of Christians, and sharply restricted Christians from evangelizing. Today, many scholars disagree over how to assess the rates of Christian attrition, but they don't disagree about Christian attrition. They concur also that by the 19th century, Christians had become a small and politically marginal segment of Middle Eastern populations in most places, or to use a term that only became common after World War I, that Christians had become definite minorities. Historically, Christian groups living under Islamic rule could only grow in two ways: through natural increase or at each other's expense, by switching churches or changing sects. Starting in the 18th century, when Catholic missionaries arrived from countries like France, and in the 19th century, when Protestant missionaries arrived from the United States, Great Britain, Sweden, and elsewhere, foreign missions did just that. They tried to grow at the expense of Eastern Christian groups by attracting members from those communities. Against the historical context of Christian attrition in Islamic domains, memories of this kind of poaching by foreign Christians, as some people perceived it at the time, led to resentments that linger among Christians even today. Christian-Muslim relations were tense in certain places and periods, but relations among different kinds of Christians were sometimes politically fraught as well, and in ways that also had consequences for Christian-Muslim relations. So to take one example, historians have long suggested that in the 7th century, the early Muslims were able to conquer Byzantine Egypt so easily because local subject Christians, the Copts on the one hand, and Byzantine Christian imperial authorities on the other, their relations were so strained, with their different opinions regarding the nature of Christ, adding a theological dimension to animosities that were already in place. Many have said that some Copts even found Muslim rule in the beginning to be more congenial than life under Byzantine authorities. In other words, that Muslim rule marked an improvement. Jack Tanous at Princeton, whose book on the making of the medieval Middle East came out last year, expressed this idea about intra-Christian dynamics very clearly. If we want to understand how Arab conquerors related to the traditions of the populations they conquered, he wrote, and more specifically, how Christians and Muslims interacted with one another, we must first understand Christian-Christian interactions in light of the irreparable fracturing of Christians into rival and competing churches. Jumping in any case to the modern era in the 19th and 20th centuries, we can see how Catholic and Protestant missionaries complicated Christian-Christian relations, even as their efforts energized and enriched Christian communities. Thanks largely to missionary schools, Christians in the Middle East became increasingly well-educated in the 19th century, increasingly well-educated relative to Muslim populations. And with education came greater prosperity, economic mobility, for example, in networks of global trade, and confidence. During the mid to late 19th century, many Middle Eastern Christian thinkers also began to embrace ideas of nationalism, and with it, hopes of achieving social and political parity relative to Muslims in the region. In ways that I discussed at length in my book that came out a couple of years ago, a variety of social pressures in the 19th century, among them this rise of Christian missionary activity, convinced Muslim leaders in the Ottoman Middle East to promote reforms that theoretically dismantled the old system of treating Christians and Jews as dhimmis, or protected subordinates, while moving towards a model of political inclusion that resembled something like citizenship. And it was this Sultan here, Abdul-Majid II, who it was during his reign that the bulk of these reforms occurred. Meanwhile, starting in the 1880s, Middle Eastern Christians began to migrate to the Americas. It helped that steamships were making, by this time, transoceanic travel fast, cheap, and convenient. Most of the migrants came from Mount Lebanon, but there were also Armenian and Coptic Egyptian Christians and others among them. And some Muslims migrated too, although the great majority of those who left the Middle East in this period were Christians, largely again because of mission school educations, which offered fluency in European languages and culture in ways that gave them confidence to venture out into the world. In the long run, most of the Christian migrants settled permanently in the Americas, not just the United States, but Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and elsewhere, where they formed diasporic communities, scattered but still connected to each other and to people in the lands from which they came. And I'm going to return to this issue about the significance of the diaspora in a few minutes. Missionary activity in the Middle East had an unintended negative consequence too, which is that it sometimes exposed Middle Eastern Christians to suspicion or hostility on the part of Muslim neighbors who feared the prospect of Christian disloyalty. In a period when Western intervention in the region was growing with heavy political, cultural, and economic consequences, some Muslims saw local Christians as potentially subversive agents as a result of their links to foreign Christians. It did not help that Britain, France, and Russia, the three great foreign powers of the 19th century Middle East, often claimed to be acting on behalf of beleaguered Middle Eastern Christians or on behalf of mission societies. And then, too, there were occasions when foreign Christians drew Muslims into their conflicts with each other. And I'm going to point here to disputes like those that broke out in the mid-19th century between French and Russian diplomats and between Catholic and Orthodox Christians over access to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the church which is built on the site of Christ's crucifixion. This conflict contributed to the outbreak of the Crimean War, which sucked in the Ottoman Empire and led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Muslim soldiers. The late historian Bernard Lewis, incidentally, cited the Crimean War and the dispute among Christian powers over the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and access to Jerusalem as one factor behind growing Muslim interest in the Crusades as an episode of Christian belligerence. And this interest in Crusades arguably stimulated a reciprocal modern Muslim interest in jihads and jihadism. Foreign connections gave Ottoman Muslim authorities other headaches too. So, for example, in the 1890s, some Armenian intellectuals who had emigrated to the United States used their safe distance from places like New York to lobby for international intervention on behalf of Armenian Christians who lived in the Ottoman Empire. This kind of political lobbying, coming from a historically subordinate but now increasingly outspoken Christian group, stoked tensions among Muslims in Anatolia and what is now Turkey. And these tensions simmered and erupted in the mid-1890s in a series of massacres against Armenians, which anticipated the genocides that later occurred during World War I. The 20th century brought new challenges to Middle Eastern Christians, and one was simply the challenge of being members of minorities relative to dominant majorities in the nation-state system, even or perhaps especially in places where secular nationalist government prevailed. And there are two anthropologists who've written major contributions on this subject, the late Saba Mahmood of the University of California at Berkeley and Hussein Ali Agrama from right here in Chicago. They published books considering what secular nationalism did and how it worked in late 20th and early 21st century Egypt. For me, one of the big takeaways from their books is that, and I think this takeaway goes way beyond Egypt, is that secular nationalism may have seemed to rest on principles of religious neutrality and egalitarianism, but in fact it really just made the workings of religion and power less visible as managed by regimes or dominant groups. Pointing again to Egypt, Saba Mahmood argued that the policies of secular regimes contributed to what she called the hardening of interfaith boundaries and polarizing of religious differences between Christians and Muslims in the country. Another way of saying this is that despite or precisely because of the government's secular rhetoric, religious bias became unofficial and harder to see, even as state authorities insisted that everything and that citizenship and everything and the sharing of resources was equal. Regardless of how we theorize what happened, the bottom line is that many Middle Eastern Christians in the mid to late 20th century opted to emigrate if they could, leaving especially for North America and Australia. There were push factors that compelled them to leave, including political conflicts in some places and chronic low-grade or entrenched discrimination in others. There were also important pull factors that drew them abroad, including educational and professional opportunities, as well as the appeal of living in countries that had historically Christian majorities, in countries where their religion would not leave them automatically sidelined. Now, to be clear, patterns of migration were not even and smooth. In the United States, as in countries like Canada, Mexico, and Australia, immigration policies grew very restrictive during the interwar period. In the United States, the door shut with the Immigration Act of 1924, an act motivated largely by xenophobic anti-Asian and specifically anti-Chinese sentiment, and only reopened with the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, which you can see President Lyndon B. Johnson signing here. Following the 40-year hiatus between 1924 and 1965, Middle Eastern Christians began to head in large numbers again for North America in the 1960s, joining other Asian and African immigrants. Many of the migrants from this late 20th century post-1965 period were highly educated people who came for advanced educations and who settled as members of the professional classes. As this generation ages, three trends are becoming apparent. First, Middle Eastern diasporic church congregations have been growing in size, number, but also internal diversity, in some cases by attracting members from non-Middle Eastern backgrounds. Second, some immigrants who prospered and succeeded are becoming philanthropists and are supporting the study of Middle Eastern Christian history, especially in U.S. colleges and universities. And third, the maturing children of these immigrants are now beginning to study Middle Eastern Christian history as well, with the result that they are injecting vitality into the academic study of the subject. And this trend is very visible, for example, if you go to the annual meetings of the Middle East Studies Association, or MESA, which is the major international conference in Middle Eastern studies. And there, panels on themes relating to Christian studies, or tagged with the label Christian studies, have become much more common in the past 10 or so years. So to conclude, let me start by saying something obvious. Regardless of the churches to which they have belonged or the cultures from which they have come, Christians have shared important things in common, and above all, devotion to Christ. That said, they have not been monolithic, and they have often disagreed and often fought with each other. In the Middle East, historic tensions among Christians, what we can think of as Christian-Christian or intra-Christian relations, have been critical to shaping Middle Eastern Christian communities. But for better or for worse, and here I think is a point that is not immediately obvious, relations among Christians have critically informed Muslim-Christian relations as well. For example, the tendency of foreign powers, nowadays more the United States than Great Britain, as well as still Russia and France, to intervene and advocate for Middle Eastern Christians, whether in the name of Christian solidarity or in terms of international religious freedom, has sometimes backfired by seeding resentments among Muslims who wonder about double standards in issues of religious human rights and about patterns of Islamophobia in Christian majoritarian countries. And to illustrate, I have a historic slide, which I think is kind of a poignant picture here that reminds us of this theme of how Christian-Christian relations involve Muslims. These are the Muslim guards at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, taken in around the 1890s by a famous photographer named Bonfils in the Middle East. And historically, there were always Muslim guards, usually from the same families, who would stay outside the church and protect and maintain order inside to prevent the Christians from attacking one another and fighting with each other and trying to keep the peace. And this is a perfect example, I think, of Muslims having a stake in it and also being involved. And now for another set of conclusions. Since the 1960s, the movement of Christians out of the Middle East has had a striking result. It has produced diasporas that now flourish from Toronto and Los Angeles to Melbourne. These communities represent forms of Christianity that are neither Western nor Eastern, but both. They are global, not because of where they are or how many people they claim, but because of the way they cross and transcend borders. Here is where Middle Eastern Christianity can help us to think about global or world Christianities in the plural, as something that combines the universal and the specific, the local and the far-flung, and that has the capacity to be one thing and to be many. Middle Eastern global Christianity, like all global Christianities, is hybrid too, changing as it moves to new landscapes and adapts to new times. To give you a sense of what I mean with a couple of very concrete examples, I'll end with a couple of cases from the Coptic Orthodox Church. Copts began to emigrate from Egypt increasingly in the 1960s, so that today there are something like 500 congregations outside of the church's historic center in Egypt. One scholar in Toronto, for example, has established a Coptic Canadian history project, an oral and public history project to trace the community's development in Canada and to some extent next door in the United States. His project, in other words, aims to tell Canadian and more broadly North American stories of a community, many of whose members are anchored by churches. And this one up here was a digital mapping exercise to show how immigrants arrived in Toronto in one parish and how they moved over time. In Australia, meanwhile, a Coptic theological seminary, which started in the year 2000, established a new campus a couple of years ago in a purpose-built 44-story tower in downtown Melbourne. The building, the campus building and the skyscraper, not only contains worship spaces, but also community activity centers, classrooms, condos and serviced apartments, and even shops on the ground floor. And this is it. It's a Poro Tower. These are some of the apartments. I was looking at it. The next one is on booking.com. You can book a hotel room. And they built a cross into the architectural design of the skyscraper, as you can see from this image here. What is clear is that the church in Australia is feeling and acting expansive and confident, with its soaring tower acting as a metaphor for a community that is not just hanging on, but that is actively thriving. It is possible, in other words, that as Middle Eastern Christianity goes global, it may find its primary home outside the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharkey, for that wonderful paper.